when we start thinking about the politics of school, we're starting to think about civics. Civics becomes a major component with thinking about how our schools are going to run. Our schools are set up to either create a reproduction model in our system, or they're set up to become a social mobility model. That's going to be a little bit more when we talk about the economics of school, but it also intertwines with everything that we're doing. So the purpose of education politically is it to create a compliant society? Is it to create a society that's going to be actively engaged and progressive? And I don't mean that in a political way. I mean progressive in a do we advance as a society? And the question about who is going to be educated becomes really prominent in politics. So even thinking about our early adventures in education, we've had several steps along the way that we had to figure out who it was that would be able to be educated at what level. When we think about the politics of school right now, I want you to really think about what schools do well. I'm sitting at Grand Rapids Public School System because it's an urban school, and it's something that I think is really important that we start to look at. The equity issues within the public schools are devastatingly different. So here, I'm 2 miles from East Grand Rapids High School, and the school systems are vastly different for resources, they're vastly different for support, and they're vastly different in every capacity. And it's all about distribution, it's all about economics, but it's also about politics. It's about keeping people compliant. Are schools about segregation? I think it'd be difficult to suggest that they're not. If you think of any public school, they're segregated within the school and outside of the school. So how does that structure occur? In your readings, you're going to find some different ways of approaching that, but I want you to make up your own mind, because this is also about how you think about your philosophy into education. Understanding the purpose of education helps you to understand your philosophical construct of what you believe about schools, and it starts with the purpose. Hi everyone, welcome to Grand Valley State University Pew Campus. We are downtown Grand Rapids, and this is where the College of Ed is headquartered in Grand Valley. In case you haven't been here yet, you should absolutely take some time to come down here and hang out. In part, to be honest with you, because the food in Allendale is terrible. It's just awful. And if you come here instead, within a mile radius, there are several fantastic places to eat. Now, what you should really think about the most if you come downtown is get some really good tacos. Just down the street, if you'll probably position yourself at some point where I'm at, you're going to go that way. And as you head that way, there's 2 really good taco places that you can get. Anyway, as we go through, I want to talk to you about the purpose of education related to economics today. And when we start going through this economic component, I don't want you to think about money. I want you to think about mobility. There's really 2 places that we think about when we start to think about social sort of development. There's social mobility, and that's the idea that the station that you're born in is one that you would move up, theoretically best, up in versus down. But you can move up or down within a social stratification over a lifetime. Jefferson hated the idea, so did Horace Mann, that our station would somehow be determined by our birth. Instead, they both thought, that we should be able to change that status depending on this idea called meritocracy. Meritocracy is this concept that we ultimately, if we work hard enough, we have the ability to change our personal sort of position in life. The issue is that it takes into account things that are outside of our control. So for example, if I'm born into a particular station, it's much more difficult for me to move up into a higher level stratification than it is to go down. So what happens in our society is if you're born into poverty, you don't have the resources to help you figure out what you need to do to be successful. Some of you, like me, was a first-generation college student. So you're going to college and neither of your parents did. That gives you a significant disadvantage. And what they call this cultural capital. And the more cultural capital that you have, the more easily you can move up in our stations. And it gives you that ability to be successful in all kinds of different realms. So if you have a lot of cultural capital, you might know how to go into a college atmosphere and study effectively to be successful. If you don't have that cultural capital, it becomes more difficult. But even silly things, like when I went to college, I didn't know that you didn't go to the college nearest your house. So when I decided to do my undergraduate work, I went to the college that was nearest my house, which happened to be Grand Valley State University. And so that's where I went to college. It wasn't until later I actually realized that you pick a college based on what you want to do and where you want to go, and you don't go the one closest. Those are cultural capital ideas. This economic purpose of education is to help us figure those pieces out. And our schools are not very good about trying to build in those cultural capitals so students can be successful. Here's an example. When you come into a school, depending on what school that you go to will determine how successful you're going to be in a particular educational setting. I know that's really confusing. Let me try again. So when you start to think about, let's say, for example, you go to Union High School. Union High School is a Grand Rapids public school system. Typically, students are less likely to go to college. Union does not do a good job of helping students get ready for college careers. East Grand Rapids, on the other hand, and Forest Hills do. Where you go to school is part of the building that cultural capital. So rather than us having what we want to have as a social mobility system, I really think what we have instead is a social reproduction system. Our schools are set up to create 3 different groups of people: working class, underclass, and the managerial class. And when we have these 3 classes, that gives us those that are in charge, and they're brought into school systems to help them kind of have that trajectory to become managers, and those that are going through the same school system as well in a different location, but their goal instead is to help them reproduce workers. It's really a little bit cynical, I get that, but I want you to think about what your schools look like. Think about how they're structured. Think about the school that you went to versus schools that are around you that had less resources. How does all that play into the success of students' ability to figure out what they want to do, or have the privilege, if you will, of being able to decide what they're going to do? Some people don't have that decision. Actually, many people don't have the decision to decide what they want to do with their careers. Many people fall into something, or they do what they have to do to get by. All of this in this reproduction model is a part of the purpose of education. What I want us to think about, and what I want you to talk about a little bit later when you start to do discussion boards, what should the purpose of education be, and who should it serve? And if you believe, like I do, that schools should serve everybody and that we should have equity throughout our school systems, what do we as educators need to do to change it? What do administrators need to do to change it? What do politicians need to do to change it so that we can move closer to that place? I want us to recognize that this is not something that you've done that makes you bad. It's something that's existing. It's not our fault that we've created this system. Instead, what it is it's this system that's outside of our control, but we have some power to change it. And I want you to change it. I want you to go in and be revolutionaries when you come into your classrooms. Decide that the system that is currently in place, blow it up if you have to. Change it. Change it to make it something better, something more powerful, something that gives every student the ability to be successful. That's what our job as a teacher is. That's what our role really should be. And if we're doing anything less, you don't belong in education. It's that simple. I want you to take a minute, and I want you to, before we move on to the next stage, which is our final sort of purpose of education that we'll be going to shortly, I want you to take a few minutes and look at the Sir Ken Robinson video in your folder. It's a great video, and it talks about this whole social reproduction model in a way that's really extraordinary. Thank you for your time. Welcome to our 3rd installment of our purpose of education, and what we're going to work on here is we're going to talk a lot about the social aspects of education. I was thinking about the social aspects of education a few years ago when I was teaching a sociology class, and in the class I came in, and in our discussions we were having conversations that were going to be difficult to have. And so I wanted my students to start asking questions. And so typically, as you know, as you sit in a class, very rarely do people ask a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we sit back and kind of passively sit there. So I decided in this particular day that I was going to make stuff up. I made up statistics, I made up things that I didn't. I created these weird names of sociological phenomenon that had never happened. Students took notes. They thought it was interesting, I guess. It was silly because if they even listened for a minute, if they thought for a second, they would have realized I was contradicting myself. And what I said made no sense at all. But rather than ask questions, because I was an authority figure, they chose to do what I said and write down and be compliant. Later, I did the same thing with a uniform and a police officer friend of mine that I knew. That was also a similar sort of situation, that people just become compliant. In this day and age of compliance, it's something to think about, that social aspect and where it starts to occur. So that's part of that purpose of education. It's one of the things that kind of creates the system that we're currently in. The question then for me, and maybe the question I want you to think about, is how does this happen that we've created such a society that we're punished for asking really important questions, that we're punished for thinking about the world differently, that in fact all of education is sit down, shut up, and listen to me, rather than argue with me and think about all the things that help us understand the world around us. Good educators have to figure out how to challenge their students in different and unique ways. Part of that challenge is, I used a church because when we start talking about social development, this was a tool to create passivity. America decided compulsory schools were really essential. That started this whole idea of creating a moral development, that there's a character development that people need to have. Different than political, different than economic, but still the same question. What are we teaching in those hidden curriculums? So a hidden curriculum is all of the messages that you're teaching that aren't content-based. So we teach those things all the time. We teach students to be kind to one another, but we also teach things like implicit bias. Girls get treated differently in school systems than boys. Black boys get disciplined more severely than anybody else. All of this is knowledge. We know this, and we see it. There's all kinds of research behind it. And it's built on these hidden sort of constructions. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to the social constructionism. But what I want to talk about now is all those things that we bring into the classroom about the social purposes. If you look at school, the question I want you to think about when we go into discussion boards, and there'll be three. One of them I really want you to consider, and I want you to spend some time thinking about, is what is the social purpose of education? What are our schools teaching kids about how they socialize, about who's important? Again, the question about who is school for, as much as what is school for. All right, so that kind of ends our final sort of purpose of education discussion. We talked about the political sort of aspects of the purpose of education. We talked about the economics in the purpose of education. We talked about the social aspects of the education, the pieces between morality, social mobility, and the intention of how that ties into our government and our civics process. The last thing I want to address as we start to think about it is I talked about a theme throughout this, and I hope you saw pieces of this in this whole section, is one of the questions we need to continue to ask ourselves is, who is education for? When we talk about purpose, the who is the most important piece. When you look at how our school systems run, what do they teach you? What is that hidden curriculum teaching you? There's this idea called an apprenticeship of observation. It's the idea that if you go to school, that your experience in school, your ability to be a part of that process of being in school has taught you how to teach. We have systems like that as police officers or with lawyers, that because we've seen it, we somehow know how to do it. The reality is that's really a mythology. But it does teach us something. And if we think reflectively about it, and we spend some time working on what the history of education, our personal history of education, taught us, it'll help us to see a little bit about what other people are experiencing. It changes our perspective. So that perspective education begins there. So here's what I'd like you all to do for me. I want you to stop the camera for a minute. I just want you to pause it. And in that pausing, I want you to ask yourself this question. What did school teach me? Yes, content. But more importantly, what ideas did it teach you? What did it teach you about yourself, about your identity, about who's important and who's not important in our society? How did all that come together to teach you something about the purpose of education? Open up a thread and discussion board and note what your ideas were. comment on a couple of participants, and let's get a robust discussion about that purpose. And this is the first section of our work. Next session, we're talking about the pillars. You'll love it. It's great.